Wellpod at DC on Riot Radio.
From meditation, stress management, safer substance use, and sexual health, we will literally talk sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Join us to dive deep into some student health questions. We'll learn about wellness together, try some coping tools, and meet some interesting people.
Your co-hosts, Heather and Craig.
Perfect blend of Campus Health and Wellness Center and Sal's.
Each week, we'll DIY a wellness tool together.
And then nerd out and dig into the science behind how it works.
Email your health and wellness related questions to wellpod@durhamcollege.ca to be discussed anonymously on air. Welcome to the Wellpod at DC.
Welcome to the Wellpod at DC, live from the Media Hub here on riotradio.ca. Craig, you look a little bit different today.
Wait, I thought you were Craig. I'm Ted.
Nice to meet you, Ted.
You may know me from a famous show.
Might have scared you seeing you in this type of form today.
Yeah, it was a surprise. Let's just say that.
Well, today we're talking about some spooky and scary stuff. So defined as a short-lived, present-orientated response to a specific threat, fear is an automatic emotion that can help us stay aware and stay safe. Described as an emotion, instinct, danger detector, we tend to fear things that lead to the death of our physical bodies, but also our social persona. This week's student question was, I love horror movies, but in real life, I avoid anything scary. Why do I always shut down when I'm scared? Does doing scary things actually make you stronger, or is that just something people say? So this week, we're going to talk a little bit about the fear and the brain. We're going to talk about doing it scared and embracing our fears. So what do we fear the most? Craig, when you were younger, did you have a predominant fear that stood out from your youth?
I don't know. I don't know that it's the same thing. I remember having a nightmare that was like the recurrent, like it was the same nightmare every time, which was pretty scary. So I didn't really like sleep all that much for that reason.
The nightmares that would sometimes come.
Yeah.
So researchers find it really difficult to study fear. Identifying fear has proven difficult after more than 100 years of scientific study. We have not come to a broad consensus about the definition of fear or any other emotion for that matter. But neuroscientist Joseph Lodot sets a solid foundation, stating fear can be defined as a state that occurs when the sentient brain is aware of its personal well-being, physical, mental, social, cultural, or existential, is being challenged. When we survey college students, our top 10 fears, Craig, without looking at my screen, what would you say at least is maybe one that you think is a common fear for college students?
College? Like what's like the future in the sense of like career and so on?
Yeah. If this was not Jeopardy, but Family Feud, that'd be number 10. Yeah, number 10 is post-grad life.
Okay.
Any other thoughts? What college students fear? Riot Radio crew, what scares you? So choosing the right program was number 1.
Money, maybe?
Money was number 3.
Okay.
Making friends was number 2. Failing a class, getting lost and settled in a new environment, missing home too much, stressful classes, roommates, and managing commitments were some of the other ones that they have found. So there's also this really strong relationship between our age and the type of fears in many cultures. This tells us something fundamental about fear development. Traditional research and evolutionary biology, you might have heard in some of your classes from your past, Craig, that in early childhood, fears of strangers, fear of separation are the most common. The next stage is fears of specific objects are creepy crawlers, and then scenarios like thunderstorms and the dark. In adolescence, our fears center more on those social experiences, such as humiliation in front of our peers. And then adults tend to have more abstract fears like failure. Contemporary research is exploring if this evolutionary fear development theory holds true. Is fear adaptive, maladaptive, universal? Is fear inbuilt? Or is it something that we are born with, or do we learn our fears? Here is a quick clip from BBC's Human Body, The Secrets of Your Life Revealed, and heads up, there might be some snakes. So, Craig, what is going on? And not me, Craig, but you, Craig, today.
I thought you were going to take over and do this part of the session too.
What's going on inside of our brain when we learn these fears and develop our fears? Our student asked, why do we avoid or shut down when facing fear?
It's really interesting. And even before I get into that, just reflecting on the video, if I can, just because I didn't have opportunity to watch it before. It is interesting. And the list that you gave earlier, like, how that development occurs from and as the video said, you're learning it, right, from the others around you. But then I think one of the things you said, not for the college students, but when you're younger, it's the biggest fear is separation from the people around you. It's just interesting. Like, I kind of don't have fear of other things, just what is recognizable to me and what makes me feel secure and so on. But then that over time, their fears are things that you take on yourself a little bit too. It's just, all that to say, very interesting that learned portion, if you will. And related to then all that's going on in our mind, it's kind of hard to simplify down into our session here today. And I don't want to get too lecture-like in terms of it, but there's a few key parts of our brain and of our body as a whole. So before I go further, our brain being part of our nervous system, but also our endocrine system, in case I rattle that off later, which is all of the glands that release hormones and so on in our body that also cause changes like our nervous system does. So hormones that we'll talk about in a little bit, things like adrenaline and cortisol, hormones that I think most maybe at least a little bit have heard of. These are all interestingly intertwined in terms of us dealing with our fear.
And not just in our brain, but what I heard in that is it's our whole body has this kind of system connected to it.
Exactly. And so all of the items that I'll talk about are one of the outcomes in terms of fear is that physical change, right? As you can imagine, right? If you've been afraid before, as we all have, right? Heart rate increases, breathing rate increases, and we'll talk more about that as we go. But there's that physical reaction to the stress that's going on or the fear that you're in the middle of. And so some key parts of our nervous system and our endocrine system that I mentioned. One is our sympathetic nervous system. So it's a branch of our nervous system we'll get into a little bit later, but dealing with our fight or flight response to fear. And then the hormones I mentioned as well, but then a couple of parts of our brain as well. And I think we have a picture that will show up for indicating one of the parts there. So as people watching will see, there's the amygdala, just a tiny almond size, just to give people perspective, portion of our brain there. And it's interesting. I read some articles that were way over my head in terms of depth, but just how connected that is to other areas of our body. We've talked about amygdala being a fun word to say previously. Another one, there you go, is the hippocampus that's related to it. And together, as much as I mentioned the sympathetic nervous system, these two are involved in a larger network of neurons and so on called our limbic system. And our limbic system is involved in our emotions. And that's what's one thing that's fascinating about these parts, what they're ultimately tied to, emotions, fear being one of them, as well as, if I find on my notes here, emotional control, our behaviors, how we act under fearful conditions, but others as well, but also involved in learning. The interplay between these are very interesting as far as, learning about new situations and so on, which kind of makes sense in terms of what we've talked about, learning to fear stuff. Like, you're not born with as we saw in the video there, snakes are dangerous. Not that all of them are, but that had to be learned if you happen to live in an area where there are deadly snakes around. Somebody probably taught you that very quickly or was always protective of you. And so these two are very interesting, sort of connection, at least to me, of so it's about, there's this fear and emotions, but also us learning about things, right? That do then kind of tie back to, the memory aspect of learning. And we'll come into that a little bit later on, but forming new memories so that I remember what that snake, just to continue with that example, but what that snake looks like, so the next time I see one, steer clear. Not I come across the next one, hey, what's that? And that I have that memory. And so as I mentioned, and as we're talking about today, we have our emotions that all of this is intertwining with, and the major one for the amygdala being what we're talking about today in terms of fear. Right. And so, it's well, maybe I'll start with a question here. Okay. Have you ever had heard a loud bang or a loud crash or something and you jump? I think it's a natural experience that we've all had, right?
Yeah.
But then have you ever realized after it was just something kind of innocuous that someone in the house dropped a pan or something like that and it just made a large rattle, right?
Yeah.
But if you think about this reaction, that quick response of, what was that? Right? That's your amygdala kicking in for protection, as you said earlier, right? Protection of, okay, something bad is potentially happening. We can't wait for the slow part of your brain to catch up here, Craig, and say, oh gosh, it's this and I should run. Oh, it's too late. Right? The amygdala is that connection point for those fears, memories of loud crashing sounds, oftentimes being bad and so on. And then the second part is when later you're like, oh, it was just a pan falling in the kitchen or something.
Yeah.
That's really your higher level thinking, your cortex of your cerebral cortex, I should say, kind of, okay, now I'm processing that information that is that's coming in. And so it plays that important role between that response for protection tied into fear, right? And then, overriding, if you will, our conscious brain. Right? And to go maybe a little bit down a rabbit hole here, well, I did yesterday, so you get to hear about it. But I don't know if you've ever heard the term, I had not come across it, the amygdala hijack.
Ooh, tell me more.
Yeah. So this is something where, using that example that we're saying, right, is that knee-jerk reaction, if you will, that amygdala reaction of, oh my gosh, what was that? But then other parts of your brain that, kick in and say, okay, it was a loud pan. Yes, we have pans in the house and someone was cooking something, whatever the case is, and you calm back down. But what I was reading about this amygdala hijack is that aspect of being in a situation where there's such an intense situation going on, whether that's something even short term but really extreme, whether that's something being under long-term stress and so on. The amygdala hijack is something where the amygdala is responding to everything because it was under those extreme situations. So the example that I was reading about in the article was thinking about PTSD, right? Why am I having that kind of response, not to a loud noise, but I hear something very simple as a noise. Someone closes a door gently, but I heard it and I'm on edge, as an example. And so it's that aspect of, there's a couple things going on. The amygdala getting us prepared for the fear, right? But then the part of our brain that says, it's okay, calm down. Well, what ends up happening in those situations, the it's okay starts shutting off. And I'm oversimplifying things like PTSD here, but it was interesting from that way of thinking about those parts of your brain that said, it's okay, amygdala, stop, are now no longer functioning. And so then that fear to sort of everything, again, oversimplifying, is there in that situation, right? And so with that is, it's tied into our sympathetic nervous system. This is the part of our nervous system, it's part of our autonomic nervous system. That is how I always think of it, our automatic nervous system, things we don't have to think about.
Yeah.
Because, again, silly example, use my silly example. It's not like the pan, makes a loud noise and you're like, what was that? It was a loud noise. I should respond. As silly as I'm being, it's kicking in automatically without you thinking about it. As we said, the amygdala is doing. But then your brain through the sympathetic nervous system is triggering things in your body, that physical response that we're talking about, right? Nervous signals go down to your heart and say, beat faster. Right? Go to blood vessels in various parts of your body and says dilate to let more blood through, so that ultimately we can increase the amount of oxygen going to those areas. Breathe faster so we can increase the amount of oxygen going to those areas.
Yeah.
Because all of that, as I think we've all experienced, right, is all that fear response of protecting ourselves from something that, as much as my example is not dangerous, but from something that potentially is dangerous, right? If I have to get out of here, I need lots of oxygen getting to my muscles so I can run away. And that's why the sympathetic nervous system, if I didn't mention already, is that fight or flight response. It's involved in me fighting for my life or for flighting, running away to save myself in that situation, right? And so it all comes back then to how is our body, it's getting stimuli in the various examples that we've talked about, right? And processing that information, some of which is going to be fear, in order to protect ourselves. That's ultimately what it's there for in the end.
Very cool.
Yeah. There's a lot going on. It's involved, as I said, in all that kind of upping of those things. One other thing that I meant to mention was just also stimulating then hormones to be released, because without making it sound even more lecture-y, if you will, but is the the nervous system is kicking in, saying heartbeat faster, blood pressure go up, etc., right? Breathing rate that we mentioned, but you end up releasing adrenaline. You end up releasing cortisol, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. But these are those hormones that I was mentioning from the endocrine system, right? And the thing with the nervous system, endocrine system, the nervous system doesn't last very long. It's really quick to respond, like the examples of the amygdala we were talking about. But then it stimulates the release of adrenaline that extends that out longer so that you can continue to run for your life, fight for your life, if that was such a situation.
Very neat.
Right? Yeah. And then the cortisol is even longer than that, but in terms of like a long-term stress, but some things that are good for dealing with the stress, like increasing the amount of glucose being released from your storage in your body, right? Because as some students, just went through or continuing to go through test-wise and so on, right? Sometimes like a midterm stretch can be a lot with a lot of tests to prepare for and so on. This is not so much the, loud noise, scary situation, but something there's a lot of tests and I'm nervous and stressed. Cortisol's being released. One aspect of which is, or of why I should say, is to release sugar from your storage, because we need the sugar to make energy to get through midterm week or whatever it happens to be, right? So there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, that's like the very toned down, simplified situation of all what goes on in our body when we're under stress.
A lot is going on. I read a 2010 study about the stress hormone that you mentioned, cortisol, and it discussed patients that were undergoing treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder and also for exposure therapy for fear of heights. And what was really interesting is they did a double-blind, I'm using some fancy science words here, but the study was a double-blind placebo-controlled study where they administered cortisol or a placebo for patients before they had exposure therapy where they were going to be talking about heights. And the subjects that received cortisol reported a greater reduction in their fears of heights and a significant reduction in anxiety during their actual treatment.
Interesting.
And so it might seem strange for that stress hormone that you mentioned to ease our fears, but cortisol is being shown to enhance our memory consolidation of new information, perhaps helping to decrease the novelty, making the fears more predictable and less scary. So interesting stuff going on in our body.
Very.
Last thing to mention before we switch gears here is a Psychology Today article highlighted how the more scared you feel, as you were mentioning, the scarier things may feel. So through a process called potentiation, I can't pronounce that. Can you pronounce that? What's that word there?
Potentiation.
Very fancy word. Your fear response is amplified if you're already in a state of fear. And so while when we're primed for fear, even as you mentioned, these harmless doors closing, little things being dropped can really rev us up. So an example I was reading, do you like watching scary movies?
Depends which kind.
I'm not a scary movie person. But if you do watch scary movies, have you ever, like, somebody maybe tickled your leg or the blanket moved and you have a big reaction, right? So we're already kind of primed and in that state. And so then we tend to be a little bit more amplified.
And that's kind of what things, since we're on Halloween, I'll go there in terms of like haunted houses. That's what these things are taking advantage of, right? Like most haunted houses, if you've ever been in one, I don't know if that's not your thing, like the scary movies, but you think about, I go in and it's dark.
Yeah.
Well, just dark alone, what happens in your body? All of the nervous system and hormones we're talking about are being released to some extent. So something like your pupils dilate, right? Why do they dilate? Because in the dark, right, even under a not scary situation, but it's like they dilate so I can get more light in so I don't trip over something in my house or whatever the case is. But you go into a haunted house and we keep it dark so that the pupils dilate as much as possible for that flash of light that turns on with the scream, and all of a sudden it's there and you're getting maximum amount of light in along with the stimulation, of sound after maybe silence. And it stimulates your nervous system to freak out.
Wonder if haunted house creators know a little bit about that amygdala hack that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I would think so.
After this quick break, we're going to continue to explore fear and talk about what happens when we do scary things. Back here on riotradio.ca. Welcome back to the Wellpod at DC from the Media Hub on riotradio.ca. Author, queer activist, and host of the We Can Do Hard Things podcast, Glennon Doyle once wrote, "If you can't beat fear, just do it scared." What is the psychology behind doing scared things? So there's going to be a picture coming on the screen here of Alex Harnauld. When I think of doing scary things, I think about Alex. There's even a verb named after him. To Harnauld is to stand in some high, precarious place with your back to the wall, looking straight into the abyss to face fear, literally. And so the image that we'll put on our Instagram account for you to see is Alex climbing 3,000 feet. There it is up on our screen. So there he is, free soloing, meaning no ropes, no gear, just him. A 3,000-foot climb of El Capitan in Yosemite National Park, California in June 2017. So National Geographic made a whole documentary by Jimmy Chin that profiles Alex. Alex has been described as fearless, and a 2016 neuroscience article in the science magazine Nautilus by J.B. McKinnon once called "The Strange Brain of the World's Greatest Solo Climber." He explored why Alex Honnold doesn't experience fear like the rest of us, with parts of his studies featured in the Free Solo documentary. Here is a short clip from Free Solo exploring Alex's amygdala.
I think all the soloing he's done has trained his mind. He doesn't get emotionally affected by it the way that a lot of people do. And not knowing about the science of that's probably a product of your past more than it is just a genetic thing.
There's been a lot of speculation about like how I deal with fear and like how I'm able to free solo. People are just like, oh, well, he must be a thrill seeker. There must be something defective.
So that clip was giving us a little bit of a technical issue, but we'll link it on our Instagram account. And basically what you see in that clip is Alex go through a functional MRI where they scan his amygdala. And the test that they use is they have individuals look at really scary images and quite graphic and quite scary. He also does a whole bunch of surveying, a whole bunch of kind of paper tests. And what you see is they share with Alex the MRI results saying, nothing is happening in your amygdala. It's not firing at all. And so in typical individuals, we see a little bit of firing throughout the different images. Certain images really light up. He's not lighting up in any of the images. So it's a really great clip, a really great whole documentary for you to give a watch to. So sensation seeking is thought to be partly a heritable genetic trait associated with lower anxiety and a blunted response to potentially dangerous situations, resulting in underestimating risks due to this imbalance caused by that low amygdala activity that we saw in Alex's functional MRI. McKinnon's Nautilus article also highlighted another experiment that was not featured in the Free Solo documentary, exploring Alex's reward circuitry. So the nucleus accumbens, am I saying that right, as Craig today from Cells?
Yes,
yeah.
yes, of course you are, Craig from Cells.
And this part of our brain, one of our principal processors of dopamine, and a neurotransmitter that arouses desire and pleasure. So high sensation seekers like Alex require more stimulation than other people to get that dopamine hit, that reward, but then also that cortisol fear response. So really interesting. In combo with this calmer amygdala and sensory seeking trait, on a personality test, Alex also scored exceedingly conscientious, which is associated with the ability to concentrate, remain focused, and see things through. He surveyed high in premeditation, meditation, and very low in neuroticism, making him unlikely to ruminate over unlikely outcomes or risks that are impossible to manage. Alex states, if you don't have any fear to begin with, there's a lot less to control. McKinnon concluded that Alex's traits that enable him to be incredibly focused and incredibly patient, but at the same time totally sensation seeking. So not fearless, but perhaps just a super sensation seeker defined by having a strong motivation to pursue positive and thrilling experiences, but at the same time having control and the regulation. Craig, Alex speaks to the joy and excitement he feels free soloing. And the student also indicated in the question of the week that we like scary movies. And as you mentioned, we like going to haunted houses. So can fear also be fun in a way?
For sure it can. And I came across an interesting article just sort of summarizing the various outcomes that fear leads to, which I'll wait on the one related to, like, yeah, it can be pleasurable, it can be fun. Yeah. And you actually touched upon some of it because Alex and the article you're mentioning were discussing that, because it's, again, oversimplifying down to it's complex in there, but it's complex in there, and other hormones beyond even what I shared earlier are being released under certain conditions, at least, right? And so one of the things, we already mentioned some of those physical changes when you're having a response to fear, right? The increased breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, and so on. So that happens, and we've all, I think, experienced it previously. But then some other interesting things that I came across can make you foggy. right? And so a little bit different than we're talking about here, but I just, as I said, rabbit holes, and it was just interesting of like, okay, what's the response there?
But what I see there too, Alex, he can't be foggy when he's 3,000 feet up. And so part of his need perhaps to almost like eliminate fear is, if you're saying fear makes us foggy, we can't be foggy when we're 3,000 feet up with no ropes.
Potentially, for sure, right? In terms of that interplay of it. But I think it's also interesting, kind of like that cortisol example you were mentioning before, where, cortisol is all about long-term stress. But it made those people less stressful in that situation, right? And so there's a little bit more, again, dynamic there than maybe we're touching upon. But I think you're absolutely right. That might be some of what is going on in that situation. But it's I came across a funny video, and it's not quite foggy, right? But it's meant to be maybe beyond foggy, but it's that protection. Right? So the funny video I came across, because it's Halloween, it was husbands scaring their wives, right? Scary mask. She's, going into the fridge to get something, come up behind and like, and what the wives did to their husbands in the sense of turn around in a full-on protective, there were some funny kicks, let's just say that. But it's that aspect of like, you're not thinking about it at all, right? And so some of the fogginess, if it were to be there for Alex, but really any of us, right, is that aspect of, here I am trying to take a test and I'm really stressed and I'm supposed to think clearly, and all I want to do is get out of the stress, right? And so I want to, get out of this room here. So just see, and answer all C and get out of here. I'm being silly.
Or just not even feel like you can remember anything in those moments.
That's even a better example, right? For those people who say like, I get in there and I go blank, right? Part of that, anyways, I've read some interesting research on some of that, but is potentially due to that increase in cortisol and that added stress, and maybe even it's not just one or the other, some adrenaline as well going on during that stressful moment, right? And then some other interesting things like fear and phobias. That was something that was on my mind as we investigated this, and it was like, those are two different things as well, right? Because a fear is what we've talked about here, a natural response of, I'm going into the fridge and someone comes up behind me I'm not expecting, they're getting a punch or a kick, right? But then a phobia is that, maybe I'll say it this way. The fear is all of us, in a way that, like, we would all agree that that's a regular, if you will, response, for lack of a better term, right? As much as you might be home and my husband's the only one else who's home, it's still, we'd all turn around and punch the person, right? Kind of thing. But then a phobia is that, I can't think of a good word.
But less common,
less
or less
common,
typical
like
response?
less typical is the way to say it. Versus, I could have arachnophobia and I'm fearful of spiders. That's not like, no, I it's different than you don't like spiders, right? This is a phobia is like, no, the way you're responding, Craig, is not like really anyone who even doesn't like spiders in general would respond.
I'd imagine too, phobias would be more severe, more intense, longer lasting, and impact our day-to-day functioning.
Yes, exactly.
Especially when we're kind of confronted with that.
That's an excellent way of saying it. Good job, Craig.
Oh, thank you.
But as we discussed, it's about keeping you safe for the most part. But then the interesting thing, getting into the fun aspect of it or pleasurable aspect of it, is when we go into a situation where we know what's going to happen, even though we don't to some extent, right? So speaking of the haunted houses and so on, well, a few weeks back, we went as a family to a haunted corn maze. And it was interesting seeing my youngest talk about like, I want to go, but I'm really nervous. But I want to go, and that back and forth. I want to do this, but I don't want to at the same time. But the thing is, then we go, and there's some jumps and so on, but you're having fun. But the thing is, like, okay, you're nervous because you don't know when it's going to happen. but you know it's going to happen, right? That's eliminating from I'm walking home and something jumps out at me. I was not expecting that at all. Versus I went into a haunted maze knowing that there was going to be people jumping out at me, right? And also that they're not going to touch me. It's all for fun. And the interesting thing that I came across is at that point, and you mentioned it yourself, but dopamine is being released under those conditions. And dopamine is that like pleasure, satisfaction, feel good hormone. And so like even that slight change, that's slightly different than, I'm being silly here, but I'm walking home down some alleys that are kind of like a maze, but I'm not expecting anything to jump out, and something jumps out at me. No dopamine in that situation. It's pure fight or flight, right? And so, it's just, again, interesting how our brains respond differently under the different situations.
I also came across not just dopamine, but sometimes we get some oxytocin when we're under some scary settings. And so the fun of frightening experiences may be enhanced by social bonding. So there's a real social aspect sometimes to fear. And serotonin, when released as part of that reward circuit with dopamine, will trigger that release of oxytocin, making us feel more connected. So fear is the ultimate wing person, according to many dating experts. So now is the perfect time if you're new in a relationship, take that lover to a haunted house and see how that oxytocin may help with some bonding. After this quick break, we're going to continue to explore how we can embrace our fears back here on riotradio.ca. Welcome back to the Wellpod at DC from the Media Hub on riotradio.ca. So how can we be scared smart, turning fear into fuel to fuel our learning and well-being? Does doing scary things actually make us stronger? Yoda once said, "Named must your fear be before banish it you can." So naming it, acknowledging it can help diminish fear's grip. In a 2024 New York Times collection of essays on fear, an article titled "Learning to Live with Fear," Alex Hernold wrote, "If you defy death and gravity enough every day, life stops being so scary." So fear is a really interesting counselor. There are times when it's incredibly helpful, warning me that I'm not quite ready for a particular challenge. The key to managing fear is to remember that it always is driven by a kernel of truth. One of Alex's scariest life experiences was his 2018 TED Talk. This man climbs thousands of feet high in the air on these mountain cliffs, and public speaking is what scares him the most. Alex dislikes being called fearless, stating, "People sometimes assume that because I free solo, I must not feel fear, or that I'm simply wired differently. But the truth is probably the opposite. I've just gotten so scared so much. I've learned how to better understand my fear." Here's a short clip from Alex speaking on Rickroll about the infamous free solo clip where we explored his amygdala.
Is there a support group you attend for people whose amygdalas doesn't fire? No. I mean, the short answer, no. You know, the scene in Free Solo just kind of shows us like, oh, his amygdala doesn't work, he's different, whatever. But like with enough exposure to certain stimulus, you desensitize yourself to it. And so it's kind of like, it's not that my amygdala doesn't fire, it's that my amygdala wasn't firing for that level of stimulus. You know, it's like I'm looking at pictures in a totally safe space, which to me, I was like, obviously that shouldn't be scary. But typically that will light somebody's fear response. But that's because they don't spend their whole life getting scared for their life. People always like to see someone doing something outlandish or different, and they're like, well, that must be because they're just fundamentally different. And then I think it excuses them from having to think of the fact that they could do that too if they worked hard at it for a really long time. And I'm kind of like, no, I can do it because I've spent 29 years spending 5 days a week training at that thing, consistently trying things that are hard for me. I don't think you can discredit that with like, oh, its brain's different. You're like, no, come on.
So the essence of that audio clip is that there isn't necessarily anything different, but just that he's exposed himself so much. And he talks a lot about how if we want to do hard things, then we have to do hard things. So if we want to do these scary and what some might claim as very fearful experiences, he's, as he mentioned that clip, he's spent his whole life building himself up to that. And so I loved the quote he once said, "Showing up and grinding every single day is one of the ways that he helps face his fears." Mary Monifs is the head of the Monifs Fear Memory Lab at the University of Texas, and she explores how a lot of psychologists believe that memory, including fearful memories, become consolidated or unchangeable, was kind of the way that we used to view memories soon after we acquire them. And this was over the past 16 years, her and her team have been doing a lot of work trying to understand our memories, especially around fear. So research is showing us that every time we recall a memory, it undergoes reconsolidation, meaning we're able to add new information or a different interpretation to our remembrance, even turning fearful memories into fearless ones. Alex Hernold keeps a detailed climbing journal in which he revisits every climb he does and make notes of what he can do better. So he believes, and what we see in research is we can embrace our fear by revisiting those memories, learning about it, getting to know it, shedding some new light, maybe even changing some of the narrative around the experience. Alex also, though, puts a lot of time into preparation. So if you watch the full Free Solo clip, this isn't something he does once. So he doesn't kind of look at that 3,000-foot cliff and say, I'm going to climb it. He actually spends a lot of time preparing and getting to know it, rehearsing the moves, but especially doing visualization. So he visualizes each move from perfect execution and tries to even visualize the what ifs if things go wrong. He even talks about even visualizes falling and kind of what that experience would be like. And so visualization has been shown by science to help reduce some of that fear. And we can kind of think of this as like pre-consolidation, where a person can kind of future see an event which will increase our sense of competence, which has been known to decrease anxiety and fear. Another proponent of visualization is David Holmes. David Holmes was a former stunt double, and he asked, what's worse, the fear of dying or the fear of not living? And as a stunt double, his job was to be the living embodiment of many of our fears. But David was paralyzed after a stunt mishap in 2008 while on the set of Harry Potter. And he learned then how to navigate less physical fears, but now moved into more social fears. So fears of being lonely, fears of being left behind and hopeless and helpless and having no one to call, the fear of being a burden. So David embraces both the physical and social fears he faces by harnessing that adrenaline that we've been talking about today to get into a state of hyper-focus. So when he was a stunt double, he would do this visualization to visualize the stunt he was about to do. And now he uses this practice of visualization to help him with some of these social fears. Inaction out of fear is worse than failure in action. So if you want to do a quick little reflective activity, grab a pen and piece of paper or your phone, or just even mentally right now, take note. So if you could succeed at any goal and failure was not an option, and I had a magical wand that could provide resources to help you achieve your goal, what would you seek out to achieve? Spending a little bit of time getting clear on this goal can be really helpful and kind of see if we remove fear, where are you trying to go in life? But then we can add visualization to this as well. And so now, using visualization to move fear even more out of the way, what you can do with this goal is visualize each step it's going to take you from how you are today to being able to reach that goal. And the more that we visualize this and the different roadblocks that we may perhaps visualize heading our way, we can sometimes be able to reduce the fear of taking those steps that might be needed to achieve that goal. Craig, does fear impact learning? We talked a little bit earlier about how learning and fear are connected here. Are there benefits to our learning if we embrace fear a little bit more?
For sure. And it's interesting. My brain's now a whirl with other things I've written
Your goal,
down,
your future vision.
But I think that, even just off the top of my head, I think that ties to things like learning, in the sense of sometimes we can, and I think we've talked about this before, we could have a goal and then it's so overwhelming without breaking it down into chunks that it becomes, that's impossible. Like what Alex says, right? It excuses them from being, like them saying that, he was just born that way. So then,
his brain is different than mine, so he can do these hard things.
Right? And it says excuses them from being able to do it if they had worked at it, right? Like, I would never be able to do it. So then, like, it's like an excuse, right? Yeah. But I think then that ties to sometimes we do it to ourselves of, this is too big a goal. Like, and I'm fine with, like, I would say, could I climb El Capitan, without ropes? Sure, I could, after years and years of experience.
If, like Alex, you did 29 years, I think he said, every single day.
Starting now, I won't do the math for anyone, but that would be, quite an age at that point. Yeah. But here's the thing, because actually I went down the rabbit hole of seeing that his mom actually climbed El Capitan and is at 70, was the oldest person to have climbed it, which is wild to think about, right? But it's the, instead of making it an excuse, owning the, I don't want to do that. Right? Like it's not he must be different. It's, I don't care to spend the next 29 years doing that, and that's okay. Yeah. Right? Because as we've talked about before, life is time limited, and so there are things that I would like to do, and as you said, right, for the listeners, for ourselves, even thinking, what's my goal for, if there were no limits, or what's my goal, even if there are limits, for 5 years from now, but then also the breaking it down. What do I have to do each day to learn to climb that mountain in the end, right? And so I think those are things sticking out to me, even about that, beyond the fear aspect that we spoke about. But I think that it does tie in the sense of it relates to how much fear there is. And kind of like you said, right? He didn't wake up one day and say, okay, I'm just going to start climbing with no rope and let's see what happens here. I could tell you without a doubt what would have happened if that's how things worked, right? And this is the equivalent of, fear can be good, but it can also be bad. Right? In the sense of if there's too much fear, as we're talking about, as he said, it could be, I really do want to climb that, or I do want to achieve that goal, but it's not possible. Yeah. Right? Or even worse is when, if you think about sort of from education, whether it's a educator being too harsh, whether it's a family being too harsh, right? That there's punishment associated with failure, and therefore you end up with fear, kind of like we were talking about, not that it's per se PTSD, but that aspect of your brain that like can't then shut down the fear to overcome the challenge, right? And so if you're in a classroom that is like too much fear is being used, or if you're in a household where too much fear is being used, as some articles I came across, what do, right? We shut down to avoid challenges, to protect our feelings, to restrict our thoughts to things that are safe to think about, and so on, in order to, try to shut that off if we can, right? The flip side of it, though, is too little fear. Right? In the sense of maybe the example of, he shows up and has so little fear that he just starts climbing. not the greatest. But actually even more extreme than that, and probably more tied to education, would be, it's so easy that it's boring. And I'm not really learning anything, right? Like if I took a same class a second time, like after having already been successful at it, is my point, is like, I'm not really getting anything about that. We move through semesters because the material builds on last semesters and becomes more difficult, if you will, tie that to fear, right? Yeah. But as you were saying, because then it ties to memories. Not to become too evolutionary biology guy here, right? But really it came down to, the bear lives by that tree. So when I go out looking for food for family, don't go near that tree, right? Yeah. It helped me survive. It helped us survive, for many, many years. So then we have that, even though it's maybe a classroom that we're talking about here, there's that aspect, right? It's tied to memory. Having a good amount of fear because I know bear bad, so don't go near tree, versus I'm in constant fear, or versus I'm unaware or I go by that tree every time because I have no memory of it, right? So all that to say, moderation of fear is good. Yeah. And fear in that sense of being pushed to learn something a little bit new, something that's a little bit tougher than the last time. Again, using the climbing as the example, he climbed El Capitan after climbing many other mountains, including, I believe, El Capitan with ropes and security and so on, right? And so it's very similar when we think about learning something new, right? And having that enough stress there, as much as tests are stressful, finding that balance between my brain shuts off, right? But but it pushed me to learn something a little bit more. And I'm not saying that brains shutting off is not a thing due to fear, which can sometimes indicate, again, too much. But I came across an interesting article here, if I find, where the individuals gave mock tests to students on a subject and then actually had them write the test under the test scenario. So thinking of my class, here's your 60 minutes to finish this test in the class, right? But then they also had people who, or with, I believe the same students, it's been a while since I looked at it, but is here's a same test under non-stressful, no grades attached, whatever situation. And the students scored about the same marks. So it wasn't per se just shut down. What that article was finding is actually came down to study strategies that people were using to shamelessly plug Sal's and come to any of our workshops or one-on-one appointments.
That I work at?
I mean, your department. But is that aspect of, right, sometimes it's that to how I studied and so on is part of the then me going blank, not just fear, if you will. And I have to maybe at least end my discussion with something I came across from Ted Lasso. His quote was, "Taking on a challenge is a lot like riding a horse, isn't it?" Right? If you're comfortable while you're doing it, you're probably not doing it right. And it's tied to this, you have to have that little bit of fear, discomfort, as he's saying, right, to push. But of course, not too much in some people's extreme situations and so on.
I love that. There are many resources that we're going to dump onto our Wellness at DC Instagram account for you to continue this conversation on fear. But this is the end of our episode today. You can email questions for us to anonymously discuss live on air at wellpod@durhamcollege.ca. Next week, we're going to talk about financial well-being. So bring your dollars and cents with you for the episode. You can follow the Media Hub on social media at DCSA Media Hub. Thanks for exploring what it means to be well with Craig and Ted today, live from the Media Hub on riotradio.ca.